first chapter to get us started for Texas government. It's called The Struggle for Texas Demographics, Culture, and Political Power. And this is the first chapter is probably the only one that's going to kind of resemble a history class, where we're going to talk about, kind of the history progression of how people came to occupy Texas. Now, for your exams and things like that, I do not ask you about dates. The exception being the Texas constitutions, which we will cover next week because they are identified by the years they are written. But other than that, I will not ask you about dates because that is what history is for. This is political science, so we're going to talk more about the concepts of government than dates. But this chapter, just kind of progresses through the years to show how Texas developed into what we are today. So first, we'll take a look at the origins of the state. Going all the way back, prior to colonialization. Native Americans were the occupants of what we call Texas today. It's believed that Native Americans occupied what is Texas for 10,000 years before the arrival of any Europeans. So the Caddo and the Apache were some of the first tribes to settle in Texas. The Caddos are pretty exclusive to the state of Texas. If you know much about the Apaches, there are different bands of the Apache tribes, some in Arizona and New Mexico, and then there's a band of Apaches that settled in Texas as well. The Caddos, if you're from Texas, you're probably familiar with who the Caddos were just a little bit. We have Caddo Lake, and there's a state park you can go to where you can still see some of their dwellings, that they built, these kind of dome dwellings and things like that. But the Caddos occupied the land from the Trinity River all the way to the Mississippi River and north to the Red River that separates Texas from Oklahoma. So they covered a pretty large area of land, and their culture was very influential in the state of Texas prior to colonialization. The Apaches pushed to the south and the west area that is now Big Bend. You can look at these maps here, and it'll kind of show you what the native tribes, the lands they occupied in 1500 prior to Spanish contact with the Spanish, and then also in 1776 when the revolution starts and America starts to form, the United States starts to form. The Karankawa and the Coetecan settled the coastal areas of the state, so down on the Gulf. Now, when the Europeans start to arrive, the Spanish, the French, the Americans, it starts a conflict with Native Americans that continues to push them out of their ancestral lands. This starts in the 1500s and will continue all the way through the 1800s, and we know about the Trail of Tears and reservations and things like that. One of the toughest things for the Native American tribes was the conflict with European settlers. Not only brought war, but it brought disease, and disease was responsible for wiping out large amounts of Native American tribes because they never had contact with the diseases that the Europeans brought with them from Europe, and so they had no immunity to those diseases. So things like smallpox, the flu, things like that wiped out a lot of Native Americans in Texas and, around what is now the United States. Now, Sam Houston, and we'll talk about him a little bit more, but he's considered kind of one of the founding fathers of the state of Texas, Sam Houston and Stephen F. Austin both. But Sam Houston, Sam Houston wanted to, develop relationships with the Native Americans. He tried to establish treaties with the Native Americans because he didn't want them choosing sides during the Texas Revolution. The Texas Revolution, if you're not familiar, the European settlers in Texas would go to war with Mexico for independence, and so they didn't want the Native American tribes taking sides with Mexico against the settlers. So Sam Houston established treaties, established agreements about land that would be allocated to the Native American tribes once Texas won its independence and things like that. But once Texas wins the revolution and becomes the Republic of Texas, the first president, Mirabeau B. Lamar, essentially ignored all of the treaties that Sam Houston had worked to create with the Native American tribes, forces many of them onto reservations and things like that. And today, there are still a lot of tribes in Texas, like the Lipan Apache, the Caddo, and the Comanche, and things like that, but there aren't a lot of reservations in the state. And we don't have near as many recognized tribes that are recognized by the federal government, as some other states do. So we went from a state that was completely controlled by Native Americans to one by the 1800s, where we had pretty much forced Native Americans completely out of the state. Now, the Spanish were the first European group of Europeans to, have a presence in Texas. So, in 1528, a Spanish explorer named Alvar Nunez Cabeza de Vaca, which you may have heard of him if you've studied Texas history, and 80 of his crew actually don't make it to Texas. They get stranded near Galveston Island. And the Karankawa tribe, which is one of the tribes that was settled there in the Gulf region, actually helps them. They help rescue them, bring them onto the shore, offer them food and shelter and all that kind of stuff. And that was probably one of their biggest mistakes, was helping the Spanish. So, but once Spain, once this happens, Spain starts sending conquistadors, explorers to Texas and what would become Mexico and South America, and eventually kind of establish colonies all through what is Latin America today. Between 1530 to 1540, Coronado and Alvarado explored most of North and East Texas, and over the next 200 years, Spain would essentially colonize Texas through establishing missions, with religion, military bases, and settlements all through Texas and Mexico, and initially called it New Spain. And their motto for their colonies was glory, God, and gold. So their purpose was to, all of these conquistadors, they were they looked at themselves as pioneers, that they were doing this for the glory of their country, that they were going to spread Christianity to, the Native Americans, who they considered savages. You've probably read a lot of accounts of this if you're familiar with this history. They considered, the Native Americans that they encountered to be savages and godless, and, they were very brutal to them, used them as slaves, murdered them, used the women, raped the women and things like that. So, not very in accordance with Christianity, but that's what they did. And then there were all these rumors about cities of gold and cities of gold all throughout what would become Latin America and Mexico. And, a lot of this came from their contact with the Aztecs in Mexico, because they used a lot of gold in their adornments and things like that. And so all of this was for Spain. They were trying to discover all these new places and bring this wealth back to Spain. But through all of this exploration, Spain starts to accrue a lot of debt from trying to maintain an empire that's so large. Spain and England and France during this time were empires. They were spreading colonies all throughout the world, but it cost a lot of money to do this kind of sea travel, to maintain outposts and places that were so far away from the mainland. And so what they did, and it's the same thing that the British did to the American colonists, was they started to raise taxes on the settlers in the Spanish colonies so that they could use that money to continue expanding their empire. but they cut spending in the colonies where they weren't providing as many benefits and services to those people. And so this gets people upset. And this is what pushes for the people living in Texas to rebel against the Spanish government and fight for their independence. And so, shortly after the United States fights for their independence from England, this kind of sets off a chain reaction among colonies kind of in North and South America. Where they will start fighting for independence. And so Mexico wins its independence from Spain in 1821. And as most of you know, if you're from the state of Texas, Texas was initially, after being part of the Spanish Empire, was part of Mexico. So at this point, Texas becomes Mexico. Now, Tejanos, if you are Latino or of Latino descent, you might be familiar with this term, but Tejanos is it's the name given to people who have always lived and have their roots in Texas, but are of Mexican heritage. And most of us, myself included, that are Mexican, if you are of Mexican heritage, you are of Spanish and Native American descent. And so Tejanos were the first cowboys. So, you know, all these white dudes that like to roll around in their big trucks with their cowboy hats and their boots, they stole that shit from Mexicans. Mexicans were the first cowboys. The Tejanos were born and raised on the land that is now Texas. They created ranching culture and were the first true cowboys of the West. And so, as you know, Mexico pushes forward, controlling all of this land. A lot of people start to settle, and you know that they come from the United States, which is now established, and are pushing westward because people want to explore this land that is uncharted, kind of build their wealth and their own land and all that kind of stuff. And so many white settlers come from the United States and move to Texas for all the opportunity that Texas presents. And we'll talk more about this next week when we talk about the constitutions. But eventually, those white settlers become dissatisfied with the Mexican government. They wanted more control, their own province, their own constitution, and they would eventually go to war with Mexico to fight for the independence of Texas. The Tejanos, the cowboys that were already here and established, they stayed out of the war. They didn't want to go to war. They preferred, like the idea you kind of think of with cowboys, to be left alone to kind of solve their own issues and problems. They had this form of self-governance called ayuntamiento, which was kind of like the common law. If there was a problem, they settled it amongst themselves, enforced their own law and order, and all that kind of stuff. And this was the law that was very common in Texas before it becomes the Republic of Texas. So the Tejanos who chose not to fight for Mexico are actually rewarded by the Republic of Texas. They're given land. They're given, homesteads to start and things like that. But once the government of the Republic of Texas is created, many of them have their ancestral land, the land that they had always lived on, taken away from them. And they were also very excluded from being part of Texas government to have a say-so in how things happened in the state. So the white folks, the Anglos. So one of the things that happened with Mexico is they actually needed settlers to come to Texas because they needed tax revenue. So they actually encouraged white settlers to come from the United States to settle in Texas. Sometimes they would give them land grants and opportunities to start farms and ranches and things like that. And then they would levy taxes on that, and that is how they raised more revenue for the Mexican government. Mexico also viewed these settlers as kind of a buffer between them and the Native American tribes that were still obviously very hostile towards settlers because they were being their land was being taken away from them. And so these settlers in Texas created this buffer zone between the main part of Mexico, Mexico City and things like that, and these incursions from the tribes that would come into Texas. Um, there were local kind of governors called impresarios who were given authority by the Mexican government to settle the land, recruit settlers, give land grants, and things like that. But a lot of the people, a lot of people say this is kind of where our culture kind of starts in the state of Texas. A lot of the people who came to Texas from the United States were not model citizens. Many of them were outlaws and fugitives who were fleeing trouble that they had gotten into in the United States, or people seeking adventure, seeking whether that was through armed conflict or exploration and things like that. So a lot of the people that were coming were not, your upstanding type citizens. They were kind of rowdy and ready to make a ruckus. Um, this led to conflict among the Tejanos, the Anglos, and the Mexican government. There were conflicts over land control. Obviously, the Tejanos who lived in Texas believed, they had been there the longest. It was their land. They should have control. The Anglos wanted more control. They wanted Texas to be its own state in the Mexican Republic, and they wanted their own constitutions where they were able to self-determine their laws. And so, Stephen F. Austin, one of our other kind of founding fathers of the state, he tries to intervene before this goes too far, goes to Mexico, tries to negotiate with the Mexican government, but they don't want to hear it. And so in 1830, Mexico passes a law to ban any more Anglos coming in from the United States. Any white settlers that came after that were considered illegal immigrants, ironically. And these settlers eventually are the ones who will push for independence. They go to war with Mexico. We'll talk about the war and all that stuff more next time. But they do win, and Texas gains independence. And white settlers control the government and do not allow Tejanos to have representation in government. Now, one of the things that prevents Texas from becoming a state of the United States for a while is slavery. If you know much about the history of slavery in the United States, there were non-slave states and there were pro-slave states. And Texas, even as part of Mexico and as the Republic, practiced slavery. And one of the things that kind of set off these conflicts between the white settlers and the Mexican government was that Mexico did not believe in slavery. They did not believe that Catholicism allowed for slavery. And so by 1823, Mexico banned slavery in all of its states, in the entire country of Mexico. But the white settlers in Texas ignored the law, and they found loopholes to bring slaves to the state of Texas. They would call them contract labor, not slaves, say they had contracts with them and they were paying them and that kind of stuff, even though that wasn't true. And so by the time that Texas goes to war with Mexico for independence in 1836, there are 5,000 African American slaves in Texas. And by 1847, after Texas gains independence, there are 38,753 African American slaves in Texas. So you can see in a very short period of time, just over, it's about 11 years, like the slave population grows drastically in the state. Texas is today and was then a agriculture state. And so more and more slaves are imported to the state after the revolution to basically provide free labor for that agriculture empire. The thing that Texas was known for, more than some of even the other southern states, was that Texans treated their slaves harshly. Texans did not educate their slaves. They did not allow their slaves to travel. Um, there are lots of accounts of how slaves were treated in the state of Texas, and they are not pretty. It's like they were unduly brutal to their slaves in the state. And this is the reputation Texas has when it comes time to talk about statehood. And so for a long time, Texas is kind of not allowed to enter the United States because there is a balance between non slave and slave states, and they didn't want to admit another state that was pro slavery to upset that balance. But Texas will eventually become a state in 1845. And then when the Civil War starts, Texas sides with the Confederacy. Um, and still, even in Texas, after the Civil War, after the Emancipation Proclamation, African Americans are still restricted in their opportunities by the Black Codes, which, if you take U.S. government, we talk about this in a lot more detail, but the Black Codes were essentially the predecessor to Jim Crow laws that kept African Americans working as tenant farmers, sharecroppers, and a lot of them a lot of African Americans will move to cities after the Civil War and establish kind of free man towns within the cities, and that's if you look at Dallas and Houston and San Antonio and Austin, places like that, the parts of the city that are traditionally African American are still the remnants of these freedmen towns where African Americans kind of made their own spaces in the cities within Texas after the Civil War. Now, fast forwarding to today, if Texas is a strong economy, and that is why during recessions, we typically fare better than some of the other states in the United States. If we were an independent country today, our economy would rank 10th in the world. So our economy is above most countries in the world. Our gross state product, which is kind of how we measure our economic strength, in 2017 was 1.7 trillion, the second highest in the United States. We are typically always behind California, but even a lot of businesses and things, corporations from California have started to relocate to Texas because we are a very pro business state, and we'll talk about some of that as we go through the semester. But how kind of our government culture allows for large corporations to thrive and do very well here. Today, and this may have increased since I wrote this slide, but Texas is home to 6 of the top 50 companies on the Fortune 500 list. Amazon has started to invest heavily in Texas. I know Tesla is talking about moving their headquarters here. Toyota has their headquarters here. So we are a very attractive state to a lot of companies because we have low taxes on businesses. We have low property taxes and a low cost of living and buying land and things like that. So it makes us attractive to corporations and businesses. Some of the sources of our economic strength, we are number one, still an agricultural state. So beef production, grain production, corn, cotton, timber for logging. Those are all agricultural aspects of the state that, contribute to that economic strength. Oil. Everyone knows Texas is an oil state. We are still producing our own oil, one of the few states in the country that is still doing that. We have lots of natural gas production, fracking, and things like that. And then down on the coast, we have the refineries that turn all of that oil into gas. And so the oil and gas industry has a lot of influence in Texas for better or worse. We know that there are environmental problems with that, and a lot of other negative things come along with that as well. But oil and gas is one of the things that keeps Texas strong, even when the rest of the country is not doing that well. Cattle, we talked about. Manufacturing. So a lot of businesses that are located here, manufacturing is not something that the United States does a lot of still. We've outsourced a lot of that. But Texas still has a lot of manufacturing industries here producing goods. So that again kind of insulates us from some of the economic problems other states have. Military and defense, we have some of the biggest military contractors like Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, companies like this. If you're studying to be an engineer, Texas is a good place to be because we have a lot of those military and tech companies here that are doing that type of work. Tech, Austin is now becoming, it's got the nickname of the Silicon Hills. A lot of tech companies are locating down in Austin. Back when Dell Computers was kind of the big thing, they are their headquarters is down in Austin, and they're still pretty dominant, but they're not as dominant as they were in the early 2000s. Lots of game production companies are located down in Austin. Tesla is relocating to Austin. Amazon just built a kind of secondary type office type thing down in Austin. So there's a lot of tech around the Austin area. So if you're computer science, computer engineering, this is also a good place to be for that. Healthcare. Texas has one of the largest healthcare industries in the United States. It is, again, a good place to be if you want to be a doctor, a nurse, or any kind of healthcare professional. We have some of the largest healthcare organizations in the country. So there is always healthcare work in the state of Texas. And then recreation and retirement. Because Texas has a lower cost of living than some of the other states in the country, it is an attractive place for people to retire because your money will go further in Texas than it does in a lot of other places. So a lot of people do retire. There are a lot of retirement communities. Even around DFW, there's a lot of like cities that are established, little communities that are established just for older citizens to retire. We do have a lot of recreation and things to do in the state, so it is attractive for that. But all of these things kind of contribute to our economic strength. Back between 2001 and 2008, when there was a lot of fluctuation in the country, and in 2008 we had a recession, we did not suffer the way that the rest of the country did. We did not have as high an unemployment as the rest of the country because of the oil and gas industry. So these things, we can talk about their negative effects as well, the environment, pollution, and things like that. But they contribute to our economic strength and insulate us from experiencing a lot of the same problems that other states have to deal with. Texas continued to grow during this time. The thing about jobs, there were jobs and unemployment was low, but the one thing Texas is not great about is workers' rights. And so a lot of these jobs were minimum wage jobs with no benefits. We have not raised the minimum wage in Texas like some other states have done voluntarily. And because we are such a business-friendly, corporation-friendly state, sometimes that means employees suffer as a result of that. And we'll talk about that more as we go through the semester. Texas still has one of the highest rates of poverty and one of the highest rates of uninsured citizens, despite all of this economic strength. So we have all of this economic strength. We attract all these businesses and corporations, but we're not investing in the people in Texas the way we should. Now, one of the biggest misconceptions about the state of Texas is that we are a rural country state. And, it's part of our culture. People like to play up the whole cowboy thing. Most of the people you see walking around Texas with big cowboy hats and boots and big trucks have never stepped foot on a ranch or a farm. They're posers, for lack of a better word. Texas has this reputation of being country, but we are actually more urban and more industrialized than many, many, many other states. The size of our state has forced government to expand, even though we don't like big government in Texas. Our population just demands that government grow to take care of the amount of people that are here. In 1850, shortly after we became a state of the United States, Texas had 212,000, citizens. But in 2019, our population was estimated to be around 30 million. And we are one of the fastest growing states. A lot of people come here for education and then stay. We have a high immigrant population. And then people from other states are coming here because of those economic opportunities. So, and then on top of that, people retiring to the state once they get older. So we are growing faster than a lot of other states. Um, but Texas is an urban state. If you think about it, we have more cities in this state than a lot of other states besides maybe California. Uh, Dallas, Fort Worth, Houston, San Antonio, Austin, El Paso. We have a lot of urban centers in this state. And so if you were to look at a map and you have DFW in North Texas, and you have San Antonio, and then you have Houston on the coast. If you were to draw a triangle that connected those three cities, that's called the urban triangle, and the majority of Texas's population lives inside that triangle because that's where the opportunity is. Most jobs are in cities. Most education opportunities are in cities, and so we're actually seeing a decline in rural populations, those people out in the country, because a lot of people will come to the cities for opportunity. So, yeah, if you look at that triangle, that's where the majority of the population is located in the state of Texas. And then, of course, around those cities, we have lots of suburbs that have developed where people don't quite want to live in the city, but they want to live close enough to take advantage of the opportunities that the cities offer. So we've seen a lot of suburbanization in Texas as well, where we have these massive growing suburbs. Like if you look at Fort Worth, you have places like Weatherford and Aledo and Mansfield and places like that that are they're suburbs of Fort Worth. They're kind of their own towns. They got their own thing going on, but they're close enough that people can drive to Fort Worth for work. And Dallas has a ton of them. Houston has a ton of them. You can look at any city and they exist everywhere. And it's so people wanting to live far enough out that they can still kind of have a little bit of a rural type experience, but close enough to take advantage of the opportunities that cities afford. And those shifts in population have also led to shifts in political power. We'll talk about that some more as we go forward. But Texas is a state that is changing politically from what we have traditionally thought about. So, looking at the future, by 2050, the population of Texas is expected to exceed 55 million. Now, these are some of the problems we're going to have as Texas continues to expand. First is infrastructure, and if any of you have driven in Dallas Fort Worth, you know what we're talking about. The Texas Department of Transportation says that by 2033, just 13 years from now, that road use will grow 214%, but road capacity will only grow 6%. So if you think traffic is terrible now, just imagine what that is going to look like in a decade. The problem is that we don't invest in our infrastructure the way we should. Texas made this stupid decision of building toll roads with the idea that tolls would then pay for more roads, but every new road that is built in Texas is a toll road. And so people who don't want to pay tolls still use the same old roads, and those roads just continue to get busier and busier, and we've all felt the effects of this if you've driven around really any major city in Texas, in the past decade, you've felt what is happening. And so this is just expected to get worse unless Texas changes its course and invests more in its infrastructure. Affordable housing. Now, even though Texas has a low cost of living, it is starting to increase, especially in cities. And Texas has no requirement for building affordable housing. Developers that do so, they do so voluntarily. So housing in Texas right now, on average, consumes about 30% of a person's income. 88% of apartments in DFW will no longer accept housing vouchers or aid for low income families. So, this means you have more people competing for the affordable housing that is available. And then, if you are not competing for affordable housing, you're seeing the cost of living go up. Just an example of this, I went to college. I did my undergrad at UNT, and I graduated in 2008. And when I graduated, me and my wife moved to Fort Worth, and we got our first apartment downtown in Fort Worth for $800 a month. That same apartment today, what is that, 12 years later, is probably doubled to about $1,600 to $2,000 a month. So that shows you that even though the cost of living isn't as bad here as somewhere like California or New York or somewhere like that, it is going up. And the people are moving to Texas from, say, California. And because our cost of living is cheap to them, they are willing to pay that amount, which then kind of raises the bar of what the cost of living is. And now Texans who have never paid that much for an apartment are expected to keep up with that. And then some of the affordable housing we do have is being destroyed and redeveloped to build these new apartment complexes, where a studio apartment is $1,300 a month and things like that. So there is a lot of competition for affordable housing in the state. Water use. The Texas Water Development Board says that the average residence consumes about 86 gallons of water a day. By 2060, 85% of residents could face shortages due to droughts because of the way climate is changing. Whether you believe in climate change or not, climate is changing, and so that could affect water availability in our state. Healthcare. 4.9 million Texans do not have health insurance. There are laws in Texas that say if you have an emergency and you go to an ER, they have to see you. They have to at least stabilize you and get you to a point where you're not in danger of dying. And so for people who don't have insurance, the ER is the only medical treatment that they get because they go there because they have to see them whether they can pay or not. Now, somebody has to pay those bills, and that somebody is our government, which uses our tax money to pay those bills. And so for a lot of people who oppose any kind of healthcare intervention, whether it was the Affordable Care Act or whether it is any kind of government-run health insurance program, they tend to oppose those because taxes will go up to pay for those programs. Well, in a state like Texas, our taxes are paying for people's health care anyway. We're just not seeing any benefit from it. So those bills are getting paid one way or the other. And because we have such a high percentage, we have the highest percentage of uninsured citizens in the entire country, this places a heavy economic burden on the state of Texas to make sure those healthcare costs are paid. Energy use. This is one where it's not so bad in the state of Texas. Texas ranks sixth in energy consumption, well above the national average. But Texas also has been investing quite a lot in alternative energy. So you can drive around a lot of cities and suburbs in Texas and see solar panels on homes now. If you drive to West Texas or South Texas, there are lots of wind farms that are producing energy and things like that. We haven't really invested in nuclear power, in a major way in the state of Texas, but wind and solar and hydropower are becoming more and more popular. Now, obviously, the oil and gas industry doesn't like that because then we stop using their product. But it is cost effective and smart for Texas to do this because we have a lot of wide open land out in West Texas and South Texas where you can build massive wind farms to produce a lot of electricity in our state. So it is a smart thing that we're doing. Looking at the way Texas is changing demographically. In the 1980s, white citizens were a supermajority in the state of Texas. That is no longer the case. Latinos are on track to equal or exceed the white population. A lot of people who study demographic trends and things like that believe that this will happen by 2050. Some people think it may happen earlier. And the reason why this is important is because it's having a lot of effects on our political trends in Texas as well. But Latinos are very rapidly approaching a point where they will be equal and then exceed the white population in the state. I mean, it kind of makes sense. It was Mexico to begin with, right? Um, so this is having a lot of effects that we'll talk about throughout the semester, whether it's political, social, all that kind of stuff as well. Now, Latinos are the largest ethnic minority. I say minority in quotation marks. But Asians are actually the fastest growing demographic in Texas. We are starting to see a lot of expansion in Asian communities, the two largest being Vietnamese communities and Filipino communities. They are actually growing at a faster rate than all of the other groups, racial groups in the state of Texas. But despite Texas being a diverse state, it is a state where we still tend to self-segregate. We don't have segregation like we had prior to the civil rights movement, but white citizens tend to locate in the suburbs. African Americans still, for the majority, are the have large urban areas of every major Texas city, and then Latinos are kind of they're middle of the road there, where Latinos are in urban areas, they're in smaller cities, places like Tyler and places like that, and rural as well, because a lot of Latinos do that type of work out in rural areas, whether it is working in manufacturing, working in the oil fields, or working in agriculture. So, first generation immigration is still a contributing factor to our population growth. So, people coming into Texas from Latin America obviously are drawn here for economic opportunity, whether that is, taking low paying jobs that are high in physical demand, like harvesting crops or working in the, working ranches and things like that, or just doing jobs that other people don't want to do. And so there's this conception, though, that immigrants are a burden on the state, and that is actually not true. Even undocumented immigrants pay taxes in this state. There are many immigrants who filed their taxes. A lot of people don't talk about this, but even if they don't file taxes, they are still paying property taxes when they are buying homes or renting homes. They are still paying sales tax through all of their purchases, and immigrants pay 1.5 billion in state and local taxes every year, and it far exceeds the amount of uh, that they take from the government in the state of Texas. So immigrants are actually exceeding the amount of money they cost the government in the taxes they pay back. So this is a misconception that immigrants are actually a drain on our governmental system, because they're not. Challenges. Some of the challenges in this kind of social aspect of things. One is education. Texas has more public schools than the population of 28 states combined. Many schools remain segregated due to racial and income disparities. So this is one of the problems in Texas, is we fund our public schools through property taxes, but those property taxes stay where they are collected from. So if you live in a low income, majority Latino, majority African American neighborhood, low income neighborhoods don't produce as much property taxes, which mean that their schools are not getting the same amount of funding as, say, a school in Southlake or Mansfield or somewhere like that, which are higher on the income spectrum. So, excuse me, we're still seeing some disparity in the quality of schools and quality of education due to the way that we fund schools. And we have a whole chapter where we'll talk about this more. Income. The Texas median household income is $56,565, but Latinos and African Americans tend to lag behind that amount. Again, and this goes all the way back to public school, because if you're not going to a good school, then your opportunities for college and things like that aren't as great, which means that your opportunities for getting high paying jobs aren't as great. So this is a whole complicated cycle, and we'll talk about it throughout the semester. White and Asian families tend to exceed that median household amount. So this again contributes to some of the disparities in the state. And then housing, that continued segregation in our cities affects where kids will go to school, what opportunities they'll have, all that kind of stuff. So it's all a big, complicated, interconnected thing that we'll look at it in different aspects as we go through the semester. Now, looking at our political culture. Here in Texas, it is assumed that we are conservative. That is changing, but traditionally, Texas has been conservative. When we talk about what political culture is, this is just a shared set of values and practices that people of a certain location tend to share. It informs their expectations of what they want from government. Texas has kind of an individualistic political culture where we tend to emphasize personal achievement, individual freedom, and loyalty to self over others. And this has become very apparent because of the COVID-19 pandemic. We have seen this play out by people refusing to accept what government says, refusing to wear masks, demanding that their kids go to school. There was just a protest today in Fort Worth where parents demanded that schools open so they could send their kids to school. Texans tend to think of themselves first. What happens to me matters more than what happens to you. So while we are a friendly group of people, we tend to be very selfish. So we don't think of ourselves in a community sense as well as we should. And so this has, we've seen how this plays out this summer with protests, my freedom, my America, all that kind of stuff is more important than what you have to say. That's still very prevalent in the state of Texas, but it is shifting and more people are part of the conversation. And we're starting to understand that there are people with different points of view and different concerns that need to be addressed. So this is part of that political shifting that is happening in Texas right now. And some of that is attributable to growing minority populations in the state. Texas has tended to embrace minimal government. We don't like big government. We want small government so that it stays out of our lives. It doesn't tax us. Texans traditionally tend to distrust the federal government, but 58% say they trust state government to do what's right. Now, these statistics were before the pandemic. I would be curious to see what those statistics are now, because we have a lot of dissatisfaction with how Governor Abbott has handled the pandemic and whether that may affect, how citizens now think about state government as well. But you could look at if you broke this down demographically, you would probably see that African Americans tend to trust federal government more than state government because of the history of what the state government has done here in Texas. Same with Latinos. We would probably say, before Trump, we would probably say that we trusted federal government more than state government. Trump, again, is kind of one of those factors that has thrown statistics off. And so what we're going through right now is not typical. And so it is shifting some of our politics here in the state and how we feel about the federal government as well. Texas loves the free market. Government should stay out of business, let businesses do what they think is best, and let the market sort things out. Like I said, the problem with that is that when you have a system like that, it doesn't always protect workers the way it should. And so we'll talk about that in other chapters, how workers' rights, protections, pay, and things like that in Texas are not quite as good and not as well protected as they are in other states. Law and order. Texas tends to, have a lot of back the blue mentality, tough on crime, severe punishment, support the police officers. 75% of Texans support the death penalty, and we use the death penalty more than any other state in the United States. But there is some shifting happening here as well, mainly in minority communities. We've seen the Black Lives Matter movement and how it's affecting Texas, and how some places now are reconsidering how they fund police departments and things like that. So it'll be interesting to see how this shifts in our state as well. So we are going through a time of, a lot of social change right now. So a lot of this stuff in a decade could look quite different than it does today. Religion and family values. 13 million Texans report they are part of some type of religious faith, the most common being evangelical Christianity. Now, the ironic part here about this is that Christians in Texas tend to want government to enforce their view of morality on other people. So even though they want minimal government and they want government to stay out of their lives, they do want government to tell people which religious moralities they should adhere to. So this has always been kind of one of the ironic aspects of our government here in the state of Texas. But even though evangelical Christianity is still the most widely practiced religion in the state, because of the growth of Asian populations and Muslim populations, we are seeing the growth of other faiths. And then nationwide, the fastest growing demographic are people who do not have a faith or are atheist or agnostic. So that is changing the way people interact with government. We are seeing more pushback in our state and around the country against this idea of legislating Christian morality. So, again, these are all traditional aspects of Texas, kind of our political culture, but a lot of them are in a state of flux where they are changing. So, family values has always been interpreted through the Christian lens, things like banning abortion, who should have access to welfare, who should be able to get married, all that kind of stuff. But that has changed a lot in the last decade, even in our state. So it'll be interesting to see how these things continue to evolve going forward. And then for our last slide, this is just a map of how Texans tend to view the rest of the country. So we are very prideful here in Texas. We're very proud of our state. If you are not from Texas, but you're here for college, this is something you will come to learn. But we are a friendly and nice group of people. But we have our problems, and we're going to talk about those problems this semester. So, all right, y'all take care, and I will talk to y'all more later this week.